Transfiguration, and going into the marketplace, if you wish, into the news media, where Time Magazine will have no choice but to say what I want them to say. Newsweek, what I want to say. The View, what I want to say. Trump shall become a trumpet, says the Lord. Trump shall become a trumpet. I will raise up the Trump to become a trumpet, and Bill Gates to open up the gate of a financial realm for the church, says the Lord.
Mr. Donald Trump.
In his first message to Congress, Jackson unveiled the building blocks of what would become known as Jacksonian democracy, a government run by and dedicated to common men. He passionately went to work setting nearly impossible goals: abolish the electoral voting system, relocate all Indians west of the Mississippi River, extinguish the national debt, eliminate the Bank of the United States, a private institution he determined to be corrupt, and do away with paper currency.
He dislikes paper money. He hates paper money. Paper money is used to corrupt. They can inflate paper. You know, you go to a printing machine and you can turn it out. It's worthless, and you get people to accept it. The only real money is what you can put between your teeth and feel it, like gold and silver.
But Jackson realized his agenda was too ambitious, that trying to both reform election law and abolish paper money would likely be futile. So he turned his attention to a fundamental constitutional dilemma that could endanger the Union itself: the issue of federal versus state authority. South Carolina was threatening to secede if forced to obey federal tariff laws. It was a position supported by Jackson's political foe, Henry Clay, as well as his own vice president, John Calhoun, a native of South Carolina. Jackson was ready for a fight to preserve the sovereignty of the Union.
Jackson said, "Tell my friends in South Carolina that if any of them breathe a word of secession, I'm going to come down there and I'm going to hang them from the highest trees in the neighborhood." When Jackson talked that way, people paid attention. The South Carolinians decided, well, maybe we better reconsider. But if not for Jackson, the Union might well have fallen apart.
With the issue of secession under control, Jackson turned his attention to a private institution he believed was corrupt: the Bank of the United States.
Jackson had real reservations about the Bank of the United States on two grounds. One is he thought it was unconstitutional. Secondly, he believed that it gave too much power over the American economy to this group of private bankers who would have their own private interests rather than the interests of the country as a whole.
The U.S. Bank controlled the flow of silver and gold upon which state banks based the value of their paper money. Jackson despised the bank's ability to alter its value at will. He called the bank's director, Nicholas Biddle, Tsar Nicholas, and the bank itself a monster needing to be chained.
It was using its money for its own advantage. It was paying to have certain men elected, contributing towards their election, maintaining their position in Congress through their generous contributions.
In theory, Biddle had nothing to worry about. The Supreme Court had ruled the bank constitutional, and its charter was not up for renewal until 1836. which would be the final year of Jackson's second term, if he ran and was reelected. Henry Clay knew a big opportunity when he saw one. Teaming with Biddle, Clay convinced Congress to pass an early recharter bill that would endow the bank for an additional 12 years. With the 1832 election just months away, Clay and Biddle drew Jackson into a trap.
They essentially dared Andrew Jackson to veto the recharter bill, thinking that Jackson wouldn't dare. The Bank of the United States was too essential to the economy, too essential to the business classes of the country. Well, they learned that Jackson wasn't somebody who lightly dared to do anything.
Jackson knew vetoing the recharter could pose a risk to his re-election. Nonetheless, Jackson decided to veto the recharter bill, thus making the future of the Bank of the United States the central issue of the 1832 presidential election. Jackson's opponent was none other than Henry Clay, who portrayed Jackson as King Andrew I, a despot trampling not just the national bank, but the Constitution itself.
Biddle and Henry Clay utterly misgauged how it was going to play. Jackson was able to say, I have defended the interests of the people, I have taken on the powerful commercial and financial interests, and he won. He won very handily in 1832, smacking down Biddle, smacking down Henry Clay.
But Biddle, with 4 years remaining in the bank's current charter, struck back in a way many considered foolish.
Biddle decides that he's going to teach Jackson a lesson. He's going to show him that a mere elected official, a mere president, shouldn't be dabbling in affairs that should be left to bankers who presumably knew what they were doing.
To put pressure on Jackson, Biddle made life difficult for small businessmen, raising interest rates, refusing loan requests, and increasing foreclosures. When business owners appealed to Jackson for help, the president was blunt. "Don't come to me," he said. "Go to Biddle. He's the man with the money." Meanwhile, Jackson ordered the U.S. Treasury to move its silver and gold reserves from the U.S. Bank into state banks.
To pull out the federal deposits was in essence to drive a stake through the heart of the Bank of the United States. Biddle thinks that because he controls the money, he has the trump card. But Jackson decides that this is a matter of principle. Democracy must rule. He pulled the deposits out, leaving the bank, leaving Biddle high and dry. Jackson could claim a great victory when the bank expired in 1836.
Jackson, the uneducated commoner, was able to not only destroy the U.S. Bank, but pay off the national debt, mainly by selling federal land. He has been the only American president in history to do so.
Jackson believed that the federal government ought to live within its means just as an ordinary household did. And when he paid off the national debt, then he was able to go to bed that night with a great deal of satisfaction. Paying off the national debt was Jackson's proudest moment as president.
Back in the late 80s, I was a pretty big silver trader and gold trader. And I don't think I've ever told this story on tape before. I was a pretty big silver and gold trader. And I always paid my taxes, and I took what was a legal tax deduction on my silver trades. And a few years later, I think it was 88 or 89 or something, the IRS claimed that what I did, and other people did as well, was now illegal. We couldn't do it anymore. But they made it retroactive. I said, "What do you mean retroactive? It was legal then. I did what was legal." I said, "Yeah, but we're making it illegal retroactively. And that's not good. So you owe us $600,000 or $800,000. For what? It was legal. How could you make something retroactive? Change the law backwards in time. It makes no sense." Well, we're doing it. And so everybody said they can't do that. So we went to court, a class action lawsuit. And the judge agreed with the IRS and said they could do it retroactively. And that's when I knew that there was something wrong in America with the IRS and the system here, you know.
Aaron, you were telling me this story last night, and before you even finished saying, in the late 80s, the tax law, I said retroactive. And I knew that because they literally ruined my dad, but he paid. He didn't know. He still thought this was America. And it was legal tax law, what you're supposed to do. They said retroactively you owe, and with not just retroactive, but they said you also have penalties and interest.
That's right.
So how do you have penalties and interest on something when they retroactively changed the law?
Well, first of all, they can't retroactively. How can you do anything retroactively? Penalties and interest are a farce. The whole thing, because they do whatever they want to do. And that's when I realized America is not America. It's not the land that I was taught it was. Because they can do whatever they wish to do. And there's nothing the citizen can do about it.
Now, you've made America Freedom to Fascism. I want to walk through that film, and I want to encourage everybody out there to get a copy of it on DVD. It was also in theaters around the country, and I think the best film out there on the Federal Reserve and the IRS and the whole banker scam, and I want to discuss that with you here. But I wanted to go back a little bit to the point that we discussed last night, where you don't advise people to not pay. And I do the same thing. People say, well, wait, you're saying it's a scam, but you're saying go ahead and pay it. And I like the way you summed it up.
Well, it's really fairly simple. I mean, since making that movie, you know, many people come to me and ask me whether they should pay their income taxes or not, you know, and I never advise people not to pay. And the reason I tell them, I said, look, I've done a lot of research. The Supreme Court has ruled that the IRS has no authority. The 16th Amendment did not give the IRS the authority to tax your labor and your wages. That's a fact. All right, the Supreme Court is the law of the land, you know, and the IRS does not trump the Supreme Court. However, that being the case, the fact is, if the mafia would come to you and say, we want $2,000 a month or we're going to hurt you, I would not advise you not to pay them, because you may get hurt by not paying them. Whether it's legal or not doesn't necessarily matter. You're going to get hurt if you don't. It's the same thing with the IRS. They can hurt you. They can put you in jail. They can torture you. So if you don't pay them, you may get hurt. So I never advise people not to pay. You know, I tell people, yeah, pay your taxes.
Look what happened to Congressman Hansen.
Yeah, Congressman Hansen's a great example. Pay your taxes. But you know what? Shut down the Federal Reserve System, and eventually you won't have to pay those taxes anymore. See, the IRS is a symptom of the problem. The real problem is the banking industry and the bankers in this country. That's where the real problem lies. That's the root of our problem. That's why we've lost America, okay? So yeah, pay your taxes, because if you don't pay them, you might get hurt. And I've heard all the arguments, you know, what tax protesters say and so on and so forth. And I don't call them tax protesters. I call them the tax honesty movement, because they're being honest, you know, at least. But the fact of the matter is, you're being forced, you're being compelled to pay it, because you're facing jail sentences, you're facing time, you're facing corruption of the courts if you don't pay, right? And so you pay it, because you just like you'd pay the mafia. But with the mafia, at least you have the government to call and try and help you to get past the mafia, to protect you. Here you have nobody to protect you. The American people are living in a matrix. They don't understand the truth of how things are working in this country, you know? And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. The very fact is that if you ask 100 people on the street, what kind of government is America supposed to be? 99% of them will tell you a democracy. America is supposed to be a democracy. But that's a lie. That's an illusion. The word democracy is not written into the Constitution at one time. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. The Founding Fathers hated the idea of a democracy. They thought it was the worst form of government there is. And I agree with them, because in a democracy, 51% of the people control 49% of the people. If you're part of the 49%, you're not free. America was founded as a constitutional republic. And in that constitutional republic that we have, 99% of the people can't take away the rights of 1%. You have your rights because you were born with them. You have God-given human rights that nobody can take away from you. The government, the majority, no matter who they are, I can't take away your rights. And that's what our founding fathers gave us. But the psychological operations that they do to us, they make us believe that we're a democracy and that majority rules. You see? And they want you to believe that. Because then they tell you this poll says this many want this, and this many want that, and this many want this, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything.
Well, Hitler was elected.
Hitler was elected. Hitler did everything legally.
And in a constitutional republic, a minority is protected against a majority. Wasn't it Benjamin Franklin, to paraphrase, that said democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner?
Exactly. And then he also said, in a republic, the sheep would have a gun to protect himself. You know, and that's the truth. America's not a democracy, but you ask the most intelligent people what form of government America is supposed to be, they'll say a democracy. Because that's what they've been brainwashed. They've been psyoped into believing that. They believe that we're in Iraq. They believe we're in Iraq to promote democracy. The word democracy, you hear George Bush saying democracy means freedom. No, democracy equals New World Order. Democracy equals slavery. The word democracy is not synonymous with freedom. It's the opposite of freedom. Democracy is the worst form of government you can have because it's majority rule. And the government can tell you exactly what they want to tell you to do because the majority wants it. I don't care what the majority wants. I live my life as I choose. And if I don't commit violence, theft, or fraud against another human being, I can live my life as I wish. That's my choice. And if I'm allowed to make mistakes, because when you make mistakes, you learn from them. You grow as a human being. We're put on this earth to become the best individuals we can be, to fulfill our God-given potential, right? We're not here to put on this earth so that the government can tell us how to live our lives and what we must do. We put into these systems and these paradigms. No. The same thing in health. You know, if you're sick, you have to have a certain protocol. Nonsense. You know, be individuals, think for yourself, have critical thinking, you know. And so what's happened is that because they've taught everybody that we're a democracy, which is not true, now, so then in 1913, they bring the Federal Reserve System into being, right? And now you have this Federal Reserve System, which then in 1913 got the right to create money for the government, when before that the government created its own money. Now the government, when it needed money, had to borrow it from this private bank called the Federal Reserve, which is a private bank owned by individuals, incorporated in Delaware. And so what happens is now the government borrows money from them to fund the government. Then the government says, well, we have to pay these people interest. How are we going to pay them interest? Let's impose a tax on the labor of the American people, which never existed before, to pay the interest to the bankers.
In fact, in 1980, Ronald Reagan said not one red cent of your income tax money goes to run the country. It all goes to the Federal Reserve.
Well, it was the Grace Commission report that said that not one nickel goes to the infrastructure of the country. You know.
I guess Reagan quoted that. Too.
Right, and so, but the point I'm trying to make is that by creating this Federal Reserve System, the government now became dependent on these private banks for money. And they started taxing us, you see. And so now what happens is that in 35, I believe it was, Social Security started. And they gave Social Security cards, said not to be used for identification, the Social Security number right on the card, right? And through Social Security, they started deducting money out of your paycheck. That was the first time they were ever could take money out of your paycheck, because people agreed to it because they thought it was going to their retirement fund. And so then when they instituted the income tax again, they started taking money out of your paycheck because Social Security could do it. And then they could do it again. You see what I'm saying?
And so now they've even taken control of the tax payment itself. I mean, literally like you're a slave. They're taking it right there when you make it.
Exactly.
They don't even trust the public enough to
send them a check.
Yeah.
Right. So they take it out automatically because they know people aren't going to want to pay it. So what's happened is that through the implementation of the Federal Reserve System, the government has become vested in these bankers, and they get their money from the bankers. And so then they impose a tax on us, which makes us more slaves, makes it more difficult for us to survive, right? Giving them more profits. And now what's happening
shall go in, and they shall say, he has hot blood. For the Spirit of God says, yes, he may have hot blood, but he will bring the walls of protection on this country in a greater way, and the economy of this country shall change rapidly, says the Lord of hosts. Listen to the word of the Lord. God says, I will put into a helm for 2 terms. A president that will pray that he will not be a praying president when he starts. I will put him in office, and then I will baptize him in the Holy Spirit and my power, says the Lord of hosts.
Today is the 6-month anniversary of his inauguration and his announcement to kill the TPP, to renegotiate NAFTA and GATT, to kill the carbon tax, to control our borders, and he's delivered in a royal flush. But the headlines from CNN and the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS is Trump doesn't get one piece of major legislation through. Trump's a failure. Trump's in shambles. Trump's under criminal investigation. And yes, he hasn't gotten any major legislation, meaning tax cuts or Obamacare repeal through, but a lot of other stuff that is actually major has gotten through, massive regulations cut, and he's gotten so much done via the executive branch because they were unconstitutionally doing most of their globalist agenda through it. He was able to turn that back on them and kill it, and then watch the economy go from sputtering and faltering and stalling, roaring back.
So I regard the Federal Reserve as one of the most transparent central banks in the world.
That's a statement. What do you fear about the audit? Give me a real-time example.
It's about transparency. It's about knowing what your government does. The Constitution gives the power to Congress to mint and coin money. We sort of transferred that power to the Federal Reserve in 1913, but I think we ought to know what they're doing. The dollar's lost 96% of its purchasing power. What does that mean? Your prices have gone up every year. What was once worth $1, is now takes $24 to buy what was once worth $1.
And that's the result of policies made at the Federal Reserve.
Absolutely. They print up the money, but it's sort of a codependency, and this is a dirty little secret. You need to have a Federal Reserve if you're going to have a $20 trillion debt. Why? They buy your debt, but they buy your debt by printing up money. So you can't have an enormous debt if you don't have a Federal Reserve printing up the money.
Give me an example, not a general swipe of review. Just say, take, for example, this. If somebody said this, it would be horrible. It would be end of the world for the Fed. Give me an example like that.
So I would envision a situation where the GAO, at the request of members of Congress, might come in and say, at our meeting a week ago, they've taken the transcripts and reviewed what we said. They believe that the decision we made was the wrong one at that particular meeting. And I would say that's an extreme interference and politicization of our ability to make independent monetary policy.
It's true that the Government Accountability Office performs a limited financial audit of parts of the Federal Reserve, but this audit is perfunctory due to the limits placed on the GAO by Congress. The U.S. Code makes several critical exceptions to the Fed's audit protocol of its most crucial activities. Number one, GAO is prohibited from examining Fed transactions or agreements with foreign governments and foreign banks. Number two, GAO is prohibited from examining all Fed actions on monetary policy matters. Number three, GAO is prohibited from auditing transactions made at the discretion of the Federal Open Market Committee. And four, GAO cannot examine any discussion or communication among or between anyone who works at the Fed about any of the activities in the first three areas. When these restrictions were originally added in the 1970s, GAO themselves testified that they, quote, could not see how they could satisfactorily audit the Federal Reserve System without the authority to examine the largest single category of financial transactions and assets that it has, unquote.
And now, the Federal Reserve announces huge increases coming in the next few months to the previous increases of the amount of money you have to pay to borrow. And as the interest increases, it's a wet blanket trying to stop the American system that empires have been trying to stop for 242 years. This is an amazing time to be alive.
Was an orphan, and look what he was able to do. Look what he was able to build. It was during the Revolution that Jackson first confronted and defied an arrogant elite. Does that sound familiar to you? I wonder why they keep talking about Trump and Jackson, Jackson and Trump. Oh, I know the feeling, Andrew. Captured by the Redcoats and ordered to shine the boots of a British officer, Jackson simply refused. The officer took his saber and slashed at Jackson, leaving gashes in his head and hand that remained permanent scars for the rest of his life. These were the first and far from the last blows that Andrew Jackson took for his country that he loved so much. From that day on, Andrew Jackson rejected authority that looked down on the common people. First as a boy, when he bravely served the revolutionary cause. Next as the heroic victor at New Orleans, where his ragtag, and it was a ragtag militia, but they were tough. And they drove the British imperial forces from America in a triumphant end to the War of 1812. He was a real general, that one. And finally, as president, when he reclaimed the people's government from an emerging aristocracy. Jackson's victory shook the establishment like an earthquake. Henry Clay, Secretary of State for the defeated President John Quincy Adams, called Jackson's victory mortifying and sickening. Oh, boy, does this sound familiar. Have we heard this? This is terrible. He said there had been no greater calamity in the nation's history. The political class in Washington had good reason to fear Jackson's great triumph. The rich and powerful, Jackson said, too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Jackson warned they had turned government into an engine for the support of the few at the expense of the many. Andrew Jackson was the people's president, and his election came at a time when the vote